Welcome to the Aging Together podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, an occupational therapist, board certified in gerontology with additional specialty certifications in dementia, fall prevention, and geriatric care. In this podcast, I interview guests who are experts in their fields and caregivers who share their lived experiences. Let's meet today's guest. Judith R. Smith is a New York City-based psychotherapist, professor, and researcher on women's issues as they age. She is a professor emerita at Fordham University. She offers support groups online for mothers with difficult adult children. Her book, Difficult: Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change, is based on a 3-year research project and brings to life the stories of 50 women, each over 60 years old, whose lives were drastically altered by becoming the default safety net for their adult kids. To learn more, please visit difficultmothering.com. Hi, Dr. Smith. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking with you.
Absolutely. I provided a professional background for you in the introduction to this interview, but I'm curious to hear your story. Can you share a bit about your background and what led you to focus on the challenges that are faced by older parents who are caring for adult children with severe mental illness or substance use disorder?
Sure. Actually, I was a child development researcher. I worked with Margaret Mahler, who was a very famous, one of the first people who did direct observations of mothers and babies. She did her study in the 1950s. I worked with her in the 1970s. And I really learned so much about the early attachment between mothers and their young babies and the importance of the first 3 years of life. And then my career emerged. I was a psychotherapist. I became a teacher at social work school. And I focused on the early mother-child relationship. And then I actually got older myself, somehow. I was not immune to that. And my son got older and his friends got older. And I also, at Fordham, the Hartford Foundation was encouraging social work professors to switch their research to study older adults because they were pouring a lot of money into universities to try to get more academics to really pay attention to the needs of older people. So I shifted my attention and I started teaching courses on aging. And then I started looking to see what my colleagues had written about mothering adult kids. You know, if you go to the bookstores, though we don't go to them very much anymore, but bookstores are lined with books about mothering infants, mothering toddlers, a few on adolescence, some on launching, and now there's something called emerging adulthood where kids, it's accepted that kids are going to take a longer time to launch and live on their own. But we talk about a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old who has more serious problems. It's as if, mothering ends. There's nothing about parenting adult kids. So I was sort of shocked and interested and felt like maybe I could make a contribution. And simultaneously, a colleague was focusing, because of the Hartford Foundation, on elder abuse. And she had discovered that the most likely perpetrator of elder abuse within the home was an adult child who had serious mental illness, was financially dependent on the parents. And this was sort of shocking. I mean, I knew very little about elder abuse, but the idea that one's adult children were hurting one's parents, I couldn't quite understand it. So I started my research project with these, knowing the importance of the mother-child relationship, hearing this thing about elder abuse. And I wanted to do a qualitative research project to find out from older women themselves what issues in their adult children's lives impacted them. And I went to senior centers, I went to union halls, I started interviewing primarily low-income moms, and then the second wave of the research was middle-class and affluent moms. And as a qualitative researcher, you do in-depth interviews. So I met with everybody for an hour and a half, 2 times, and transcribed the interviews. And just listen to them and you come up with themes. It discovered many commonalities across ethnic groups, across class, across the severity of the kids' illnesses. I guess what I learned, the first thing I learned is that, because I didn't know what mothers would say to me in terms of what their concerns were. Were they going to say, well, my daughter married somebody out of our faith? Or my mother might have said she doesn't visit enough. So what were the things, how were parents in later life affected by their kids' issues? And what I discovered, the people who said, I want to talk to you, were all people whose adult children had serious mental illness or substance use disorder. So this was my first finding, that this was really something that was weighing on older mothers, and they didn't know where to turn. And I listened to their stories and wrote many papers for academic journals, and then realized I really wanted to be talking to the mothers themselves, and wrote a book. And now I run support groups for moms who are in this situation, because it's as if this whole experience of being 60, 70, 80 years old and still acting as a mother because your kid is not able to support themselves and has maybe in and out of hospitals, in and out of rehab, and mothers feel still responsible. And their friends may think they're crazy. What are you doing? You've tried this 20 times. One woman I talked to, her daughter had her first break when she was right out of college. She was hospitalized. When I met the mom, she was 80, and she had moved her daughter. This mom had financial resources, so she did not have to have her come live with her. When she came out of the hospital, she was able to pay for a separate apartment. But the mother had moved her 21 times in 20 years because the horrible thing about mental illness, untreated mental illness, is most people who have serious mental illness don't realize that they have mental illness. So there's something called anosognosia, that is where your brain does not, I think we're more familiar with it with people who've had strokes, that your right brain doesn't realize that your left arm is paralyzed. So you try to lift your arm to get it. Well, it's the same thing with mental illness, that there's something going on in the brain where people don't recognize that they have this illness. So if you don't think you have a mental illness, why would you take medication? So people go to the hospital, they get stabilized on the medication, they come home, they're supposed to continue with the medication, see a therapist, but they don't go because they don't think they're sick. So you end up being a parent who has a kid who has untreated mental illness and can have psychotic breaks, once a year, a couple of times a year. And it's a very scary situation. And now our care in psychiatric hospitals has changed. We got rid of the Willowbrooks and the long-term asylums. So it's very hard to get into a hospital. If you get to stay for 24 hours, you and your family are lucky. If you stay for a week, that's, you've hit the jackpot. When I did my training, people would stay for 3 months. That was a regular hospitalization. But everything has changed. And we don't want to keep people in hospitals against their will. But this ends up being that so many people are not being treated. And who is left? Who's going to take care of these people? And what I discovered is there's so many moms who will not turn their back on their kids and are doing whatever they can to try to keep them safe.
First I want to point out, with all the work I've done in the elder space, this is definitely not a topic that I've ever considered. Mm-hmm. So I thank you for even talking about it and doing the research and bringing it up, because it surely is an issue that I'm sure I've come across and have neglected to address it, right? 2, I noticed you spoke a lot about the mothers. Why specifically focus on the mothers when you were doing this research, and, especially with those challenging adult children?
Well, first, it was methodological. I was doing a small study. So if I had done moms and dads, you wouldn't have the ability to really control for the differences. But it was also theoretical. I am a feminist, and I really believe gender plays a big part in caregiving in general. Nancy Hoyman's work really has influenced me, who has said that it's ridiculous that we have this gender-neutral word, caregiving. What is it, 80 or 90% of the people who are providing care are women. So, same with parenting. We know that men and women perceive and act on their role as parents in very different ways, both in how much they do, what they do, how much brain work goes on all the time. So I really think gender is an issue, and I wanted to really, start with women. If I had been younger, I would do the same study all over again with men. But also when you talk about older women, and I was interested in people over 60, many of them, they were all married when they had the kids, but many were no longer married. In particular, if you have a difficult adult child, it's very hard to have a marriage because you have different ways of thinking about it. There's a lot of resentment of who's doing what. And it's an impossible situation, so it's easy to blame each other. So I started with women, and I think what I was very glad I had done that, because I really think that our view of women's roles and each of our internalized view of what we need to do as mothers is very unique and very powerful. And, everybody who spoke to me was speaking about being a mother. When they talked about, one woman I met her at a legal agency. She had come to see how she could evict her daughter and grandson who were living with her, because she had just come from the doctor, and the doctor said that her blood pressure was, could kill her, that she had to get rid of the stress in her life. And she knew the stress in her life was she was living with her 50-year-old daughter and her 18-year-old grandson, both of whom had bipolar, and they were driving her crazy. I mean, it was she was not wealthy. It was a tiny apartment. And she said to me, well, what am I supposed to do? Throw them away? I mean, that's my grandson. That's my daughter. And I think that's what people feel, And the truth is, and we know about infants, that partially why the human species survives is it's crazy all that we do for an infant, right? We give up our sleep. We're there completely. It's nuts. It's not what we do for anyone else. And that's what has allowed human beings to survive. But if you listen to, as I did, these mothers who have adult kids, they're feeling the same way. The problem is, a baby will take all the caregiving and blossom. An adult child who has mental illness or has a substance use is not thrilled to have their mother want to help them, and often will not cooperate. So none of these women actually think of themselves as caregivers, because I think being a caregiver assumes there's someone who says, oh, my caregiver is here and they're going to help me. But adult kids saying, get off my back. I'm an adult. I don't need you, even though you're sitting in jail or you're, being discharged from a hospital and have no place to live. So it's one of the most horrible aspects of caregiving, because I think many people who take on caregiving, there's a lot of positive things that emerge from it. There is some gratitude. Even if you have a cranky mother or a cranky father, there is moments of gratitude. And with an older person, you also know it's going to end. With a young person, women are terrified, because what happens when I die? Who's going to take care of my child? And as much as mothers try to, people who have money can get their financial person to be the fiduciary agent who will give their adult child enough money to pay their rent. But they want somebody who's going to be there and look after them. And you can't find anybody who will do what a mother does. I mean, there could be more nations like Sweden and Norway have more socialized medicine, and they will have housing that's supportive for people who have serious mental illness or substance use disorder. I mean, we in the United States, if you're trying to get into supportive housing, where if you have a disability, you can go on SSDI. It will pay for you being in there, but you can't go in if you have a substance use disorder. Whereas in Sweden, you can go in even if you're still an addict. But we have such stigmatizing attitudes towards people who have substance use problems. And the rents are so impossible. So if you want to be able to pay for your kid to have a separate apartment, or if they're stable enough to work at McDonald's, you can't afford housing anymore. So we have a housing crisis. We have lack of a government policy that will really provide enough housing for people that's not in mommy's house. And so mothers are really left in a terrible place. So we know that so many of the homeless have a mental illness. And so many of the mothers I talked to were at the place of, if not me, who? And my child will be on the streets if I can't live with this. And what they have to live with can often be horrible for somebody who's not taking their medications, who has a substance use disorder where they're continually blacking out or they could become very angry. And it's not a happy situation. But I think you're right that there is not enough attention given to older women and seeing them as caregivers. You know, when we think of caregiving, we think of young people taking care of older people or spouses taking care of their husbands. But everybody who has a mental illness, which is over 6 billion people in this country, has a mother and father. And they are going to be the first place that a person does. And to be the person who's most worried about them. And how we've managed to not pay attention to them is pretty remarkable, really.
I remember we talked a little bit about how your research led to your book, which we'll get into in a minute. But the terms or the terminology that you've kind of coined for this is difficult adult children or difficult mothering. And I remember you mentioned something about how, they're not meant to be purgatory, but someone might find it that way. Mm-hmm. What does the term difficult adult children encompass in the context of your book?
That it's an adult child who is not able to be independent, who is not able to keep a job, who's not able to have a loving relationship. They can't afford housing, and there's no one who's going to take care of them except their mother. And their mother wants to do all they can. And it's just difficult. When I came up with the title for the book, people said to me, you can't call people difficult. It's not politically correct. As a social worker, we're not supposed to say this is a difficult client, but there are difficult clients. There are people who will not take your help, who will yell at you. And that's sort of what a difficult adult child is, that you want to help them, but you can't. And the difficult mothering is you're up all night. You at 2:00 in the morning, nearly every mother who I meet is up worrying about their kid, but their worrying can't easily translate into fixing it. So it's extremely difficult. And it's difficult also because there are not societal resources to support these women. We now have caregiving groups for people caring for a parent or a spouse with Alzheimer's. Why don't we have caregiving groups for people whose kids have serious mental illness or substance use disorder, even if most substance use facilities don't want to talk to the parents? It's a very anti-mother and anti-woman culture in many of the substance use rehab centers. And so women are really left very, very much alone. And also, they stopped talking to their people who had been their confidants, their own sisters, brothers, best friends, because people can't really understand it. They feel like, kick them out, get them out of there. What do you need this for? You're 70 years old and you have Parkinson's. What do you need, this lug sitting in your bedroom eating up your food, that people can't understand. And I think it's a maternal feeling of who else is going to do this? And I just can't turn my back to my child.
Yeah. I've definitely encountered clients with that situation where they'll say, if I don't do it, who will? And, oftentimes I've heard it more for spouses mm-hmm. who have high level of needs, right? But it's really interesting to hear that applies so well to older mothers who are still parenting their adult children. You did a ton of research on this because there wasn't really much out there for you to begin with, right? How did you approach this research for difficult, right? And what were some of the challenges that you encountered? And what more, you talked a little bit about the stigma, but what more did you learn about the stigma that the mothers may feel when their children are struggling with issues like mental illness or substance abuse?
Well, I think, if your child has cancer, people know how to respond, right? If they come back and live with you and your daughter is divorced and has breast cancer, I mean, not breast cancer, it's less frightening, but people know what to do. They show up, they bring food if you're having to go to the hospital when your adult child is in the hospital. When somebody has a psychiatric illness, people don't know what to do. They certainly don't show up with a casserole. They probably might say, how's Johnny the first time you see them, but then they stop calling because there's something about mental illness that scares us and we don't know how to be helpful. So I think these mothers all felt a gradual sense of loneliness and isolation because nobody seemed to understand. People seemed to think that they were making bad decisions by hanging in there. And the loneliness, I think, women describe as really the most, on top of everything else, is just feeling so lonely and also blaming yourself. Because I think we have all assumed as mothers that we can make everything all right. We can kiss the boo-boo and it's going to be okay. And I think we each have believed that we are very, very powerful. And when we're faced with that we can't fix this and serious mental illness, if it can't, or right now there's some good data about if one gets treated for early onset of serious mental illness, then it's much more likely the person will take the medication and they can have a normal trajectory. But if that doesn't happen, it's a long route. And so this sense of being alone with this is very, very difficult. And when the mothers come in my group, there's such a sense of relief to be with other people who understand. And the groups that I run are 10 weeks. And when the group is over, I hope and I work with them that the group will meet without me, because this may be a lifelong problem. And to be able to have other people who understand it, aren't going to criticize you. Mothers are called being codependent, being enablers, that you shouldn't be doing this. So I think what it feels like to these mothers is feeling alone, not feeling understood. Nobody wants to hear about it. I mean, when I'd go to people's houses and they tell me their stories, I remember one woman, she walked me to the door and the interview was over and she just went, shh, sort of like, it was so good to be able to tell someone about this because nobody wants to listen. And I think health professionals aren't, first of all, because of HIPAA, you can't even talk to the mom. And mothers are treated as if they're, busybodies trying to get in there. It's very different than a spouse. So the mothers are, maybe living with their kid, but nobody wants to talk with them. So it's a very lonely life. And when you don't see your story out in the public media, it's very, very hard.
So you ran these focus groups with these mothers, learned a lot from them. You pulled themes from them, and then I believe you turned that into the book, correct? Can you explain that process a little bit and how you got from the research to the book?
Sure. Well, first of all, I didn't run focus groups. I did individual interviews with people. I'm running the groups now.
Okay.
So the individual interviews, I didn't have the word difficult till way down the process. I said, when I went to a senior center, they would let me talk right before bingo. And I'd say, how many of you were parents? And everybody said, me. And I said, what were the problems when your kids were 3 and 5? And everybody's very excited to talk about it. And I said, how about when they're 40? And then the room got very quiet. And people would say, drugs, divorce. I'd say, okay, I want to talk to you. And I'd stand in the corner, not knowing if anybody would come. But they did. Not a lot, but a few people each place. And then I took their phone number and arranged to meet with them individually. And I made the decision not to say, tell me about your adult child's problems. I mean, I asked them in one sentence just before we go, how would you summarize the problem? And then I said, tell me what it was like when they were born. So to talk about the more positive and easy periods of life. And then we got to when the problems started to emerge. For some people, it was when their kids were teenagers. Substance use often begins, in teens. Mental illness usually begins in the early 20s is the first break. So I got them to really narrate what their life had been like with this person and how things changed. And, I came up with the word, when they really became difficult. So I did all these interviews, listened to the audio, had transcripts, read them over, came up with the themes, wrote academic papers. And then actually I was interviewed by a colleague for a radio show, Health, Etc. And her husband happened to be listening to the recording, and he was an agent for books. He said to my friend Barbara, this is a book. So that was the beginning of my realizing I could really take what I had learned and bring it to people. And I was very lucky that I got coverage in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal when the book first came out. So, gradually people are getting to know about my work. And first I was running webinars to talk about the issues. And then when I ran a webinar is, people can't see each other. They're just typing in there. They can see me. And people were so excited that they were, connecting with other people. You could feel like people wanted to pounce into the computer. I said, I have to run a group. So I started running support groups. And, this started in COVID and people came. And they're very powerful and very helpful to people. And there are other places. There's the National Association of Mental Illness that offers support groups for families. But many of the people who go to NAMI are in the very beginning when they're first realize that their kids have a mental illness. The people I was interviewing, because they were over 60, had lived with this already for many years. Mm-hmm. So they were not with just beginning to try to figure out what was going on. They had lived with this. They knew this was going to be around for a while, and they knew they were hanging in there. And so I think the people who come to me are a little different than people from NAMI because they're generally older and really have a handle on that their kid has a problem. They've gotten a lot of help so far, but nobody has really focused on them in the way that I try to do.
You talked a little bit about the stress, the loneliness that the mothers experience during this process. In your book, you discuss the emotional toll on the mothers when their adult children have untreated mental illness or substance use disorders. What are some of the common psychological and emotional challenges that these older parents face in these situations, and how do these challenges affect their well-being mentally and physically when they're over 60?
Well, first of all, they are experiencing a lot of self-blame. Mothers, there's comedians make jokes about mothers being, the guilt bearers of everything and can make you feel guilty. But the truth is, other research has shown that women do experience guilt more than men do. When you feel guilt, you're blaming yourself for not having done something right. And when you're doing that all the time and you, at the same time, your efforts are not fixing the situation, you feel helpless, you feel powerless. And this is what we call depression. Mm-hmm. If you really feel like it's somehow your fault, you weren't a good enough mother, you can't figure out how to get him to stop using drugs or drinking, you internalize it and you become depressed. And when you're depressed, your energy is diminished. And many of the women had other complicated, blood pressure gets affected. As one mom told me, when I asked her the difference, she had a husband who was still very involved and very supportive. And she said, the difference between me and my husband is his insides are not being eaten up. She said, I feel like, and she did in fact have an illness where her insides were being eaten up, but the stress can lead to physical manifestations. And like with the mom that I talked to you about before, where her blood pressure was so high, as we get older, there's so much we have to do to take care of ourselves. And if you're also at the same time trying to take care of someone else, one mom who was in her 50s when her son, they were trying to figure out what kind of care he needed. She put off having a hysterectomy, which she really needed for medical reasons, for 3 years. I mean, she could have died, but she felt like, I don't have time to do this, because it ends up being that you're prioritizing someone else's health, somebody else's well-being. And the idea of going for a walk, seeing a friend, going to the doctor just seems you don't have the energy to do it.
Yeah. Guilt is one of those very strong manifestations in a lot of aspects of caregiving. You know, in a lot of the work and interviews and conversations that I have, we talk a lot about guilt and resentment. In your work, what advice would you give to parents who feel that guilt or feel responsible for their adult children's struggles? And how do parents find that balance between their own needs and the needs of their adult children, so they're not neglecting that hysterectomy that they need, or they're not neglecting that annual screening that they should have been getting, right?
Well, I think there's guilt and there's shame and there's mother blame. Professional articles have looked at the journals, how much my field has blamed mothers. It used to be that autism was assumed to be because of a mother being a refrigerator mom or being cold. I mean, this was from the highest psychiatrists. He named mothers of autistic kids as refrigerator moms. So mother blame has been documented throughout medical history, that we are told that we have actually caused so many things. Single mothers causing the poverty of their kids. So there's societal mother blame. So partially what I do in the book and when I talk to mothers is really start having people understand that mothers have been blamed for so much. And we have to think of that as a structural problem that's affecting everyone. The other piece is, in terms of what causes mental illness, we no longer believe that it's all nurture at all. You know, that it's genetic. There is a huge piece, but then some people end up feeling, well, I shouldn't have had kids. But, that's not where we are as a society, that we don't have children because of having an illness. And you don't know if your child is going to get what Grandpa Joe had. And then the shame is really feeling like you're a bad person. And I think, one social worker that I worked with told me that she was working with a client who, adult child, when the daughter was like 12, the mom was working full time to support her and her other children. She was a single mom. And her daughter told her that she was being abused by a family member. And the mom, she couldn't take it in. 30 years later, her daughter is, a very angry, aggressive person with a mental illness who's literally attacking her mother, living with her and hurting her mother. And the social worker said to her, if your neighbor had done something bad to her daughter when she was young, how many years do you think she should suffer for this? How long is the sentence? Yes, it would have been better if this mom could have taken in this, but to now allow her daughter to literally bite her, kick her, throw things at her, that punishment doesn't meet, the crime. And to somehow, what the social worker did is gradually teach this mom to set some boundaries. And she, with time, had her get an order of protection. First, she had her evict the daughter, but the mom took her back in half an hour. Then she got her an order of protection, which is really a piece of paper that says, within the home, you can't hurt me. And when the daughter would start to be abusive, she would hold up the piece of paper. And that helped. She felt empowered to say no. So to really work with people to take small steps to set boundaries and what I do with the women I see is I'm not giving you strategies about how you're going to help your adult child. You probably know them all. You've tried them all. I'm going to work on what small steps you can take for yourself. And that's really what our work is. And that's the book is the first part is about the problem, and the second part about is change. And it's change in small steps. There's some books that say, just walk away, you're done. God bless you, I did all I can, I'm finished. The people that I interviewed and that I have met are not walking away, but they have to find some way to be safe, to be healthy. And that's also going to help their kids, because if you let your child hurt you, they can end up in jail, and that's certainly not going to help them. Or if they kill you, that's certainly not going to help them. So you really want to help people to set boundaries and to feel that they are entitled to have a life and to not be punished forever for, most of us are not perfect mothers. Some of us were less than perfect, but we don't have to be beaten up for the rest of our lives by ourselves or by our kids.
Yeah. Setting the boundaries is a big learning curve for most people, right? Unless you were raised in a family that had very healthy boundary setting and had done the work to teach it and grow from it, there's very few that I've seen who are good at it, right? And learning that as an adult is already hard, speaking for myself, but I can't imagine having to learn how to set boundaries when you're 60 or 70 if you haven't set them your whole life. We also talk about when helping becomes enabling in a lot of these situations. And it's hard to sometimes understand how that's different, because a lot of times people feel like they're just helping. And oftentimes, a lot of that help is actually enabling certain behaviors. And so, one, how can parents differentiate between whether they're helping or enabling when they're supporting these adult children? And then two, in that change section of difficult, what strategies does it offer to help these mothers or parents manage their stress and emotional health?
Well, one thing I have in the book is a depression scale and an anxiety scale. So if you find out you're on the upper scale of, I say, go to your doctor. And antidepressants, I'm a firm believer in them. I think if you can somehow get help to lower your own, either anxiety or depression, it helps you to be able to more clearly make decisions. And I think I don't like the word enabling personally. I think the difference may be when someone has a physical illness or when they're elderly, we want them to be able to do as much as they can on their own. And the problem with the untreated mental illness is, unless they're getting medication or they're seeing a therapist, things are not going to get better. So you're not enabling by trying to find a safe place for them to live. You are trying to be, the last ditch safety net for them at this point. And I think substance use is different than mental illness, because hitting bottom doesn't necessarily work for people with serious mental illness. It can just lead to another psychotic break. And the more psychotic breaks you have, the more damage there is to the brain. So I think what happens when people work with me is that they begin to see the illness in their child as something outside of themselves, something they did not cause. And then you begin to see what your options are. And it's also, for some people, but more so with substance use than mental illness, it's sort of taking off your blinders. One mom, she just didn't acknowledge that her son had a very serious problem with alcohol. And he was living in her house, and he had a good personality. He would help with chores. But she didn't let herself see that he really had a substance use disorder. And finally she saw, and she got an intervention, came, and her son went into rehab, and he's very thankful to her that she did that. Not many people have that great an outcome so easily, but I think the more we can really not blame ourselves and really see that this is mental illness, this is a substance use problem, then you begin to know what your choices are, And you sort of make a decision among the choices of what will work for you. And for some people, one mom I worked with, she has 4 daughters. The youngest has serious mental illness. And her 3 other daughters are very angry that she keeps rescuing her. But that's what she's going to do. I mean, she knows she's still there for her other kids. She's a wonderful grandmother, but she knows she cannot just let her child's, her child tends to run away and fly to Brazil, and she flies and finds her and gets her out of there. She has the resources to do it, and she's going to do all she can to hopefully get her daughter help. And she'll still be a great grandmother to her other kids. So I think you're right that we want to help our kids get on their own feet, to go into rehab, to see the doctor. But as a mother, you have very little power. I mean, I just spoke to somebody today who was just given her child wrote out a contract. I guess her child's 27 and living with her, that if you do not, she found a rehab program that was covered by a psychiatric day hospital. It was covered by her insurance. If you do not enroll in this program by Friday, you're out of my house. Whether she will act, I don't know. I mean, it's up to both of them. I mean, if the son will agree, but that's a reasonable plan where she's really saying, you've got to get help. And I can't keep saying it's okay that you don't get help. So I think that's a way of helping instead of enabling. Whether she will be able to, if he doesn't do it, take the next step, I don't know. I mean, she has a good situation that the 27-year-old has a psychiatrist and a coach. So it really might work.
Yeah. According to your findings, how important or not important did you find community and social supports for these mothers? And what resources or support systems are available for parents in these challenging situations? I know you mentioned there's not much out there, but what, if anything, have you found that's available?
I mean, often elder abuse has now gotten a lot more funding. Most large cities have social workers and within the Department of Aging services for people who are experiencing abuse by their adult children. Problem is, I think it's not a great word. Like many of the moms who I interviewed, whose kids who I actually had recruited, I recruited in some elder abuse centers. They were getting service from an elder abuse service center. But in the 3 hours that I talked to them, they never once used the word abuse. We don't think when our kids scream at us or when they take our money or when they, like that mom I told you about when her child was biting her, that that's abuse. We think of abuse as something that happens to people outside of us. And we also don't think of ourselves as elders. But there is, if you are living with someone, with your adult child who is verbally, emotionally, financially hurting you, there are agencies in every state, in every city, where you can call and get help, and somebody will help you, tell you what your options are for setting boundaries, is really what a lot of that work is. And the work that is most helpful is if the agency can also help your adult child, can get them into a rehab program, can help them get hooked up to partial hospitalization. You can't work with one half of the dyad. There's, a mother who's concerned about her kid. If you just say, kick him out, she's not going to listen to you.
A lot of my work is centered around proactive long-term care planning for older adults and adults. In these situations where the parent has never really left the parenting role and likely cannot rely on their children to help them when they need help, how do these parents prepare for that future for both themselves and for their adult children?
I think most of them talk to me about their concern about their adult children.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And that's a hard one. You can set up trusts that will, if you have resources, and some trusts, can be based on incentives. So you can say Susie will only get, $1,000 a month if she is taking her medication. But not every state allows that. And it's interesting. Very few moms talk to me about their own healthcare plan, but did express regret that here I am worrying about Johnny, and Johnny, I'm 80 years old and I can hardly walk, and Johnny's not worrying about me. So it's, I hadn't really thought about how that was really not, I didn't ask you about it, but in our discussions, it was much more what happens when I'm gone for my child, not what happens, who's going to take care of me as I, lose my abilities.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is mothers tend to live with this idea that they'll just figure it out because they're used to just figuring things out, right? And that's part of the work I do, is really trying to get people to understand that they shouldn't be waiting for that bridge, that they should actively plan ahead for that bridge, right? And so I can only imagine how difficult it must be for them to think about themselves in that situation when they're just so worried about their child. You've given me a lot of anecdotes and stories and examples of the women that you interviewed, and then also some of the women that you continue to speak with. Can you describe a particular story, either from the book or from the work that you do now, that exemplifies a difficult adult child or difficult mothering, and how your work has helped them?
Well, more from my research, a positive outcome occurred. One mom had a son who moved back in when he had a young child, and the marriage fell apart, and he moved in. The parents were surprised that the marriage had fallen apart, and then here he was, the dad with his 5-year-old kid living with them, but they were glad to have him back. And a year later, she discovered needles in the bathroom and, was shocked and said, this can't continue, got her son into taking methadone. And then he started using again after a year. And then they actually evicted him. The mother took this young boy, and she lived in a small exurban town, and her son was homeless in their town. And all her friends saw him selling drugs, behind Costco. And she lived with the shame, and she just was not going to take him back. And he got arrested several times. And on the third time in jail, he fell in love. He somehow met a woman I've never really figured out where he met the woman through the jail. Obviously, they're not in the same jail. But she said it was a coming to Jesus moment. He just somehow said enough. I guess when you're in jail, the good thing about jail for somebody who has a substance use issue is you're not using it, except you can get drugs in jail. But this kid was not. And he became clean. He married this woman. They have a child. This woman now has a grandchild, but she really took the tough act of evicting her son. And she said, when I met her and talked to her, she says, they call it tough love, that I was able to do tough love. It is the hardest thing you can ever do. So it doesn't feel like love when you're doing it. It feels like hate, and it's awful to have to evict your own child. I think it's much more doable, and there will be more success rates with people who have an addiction than someone who has a serious mental illness. And, to live on the streets with an untreated mental illness, as we all know, there's no good outcome there.
Yeah.
Cities and states are working to try to figure out how to help the homeless.
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that these situations, these difficult adult-child relationships, often tend to dissolve marriages or highly impact marriages. What impact does that relationship with their adult child for the parents impact the parents' other relationships, whether it's with other children, maybe their own parents, or friends and other family members? What have you found that impact to look like?
Well, certainly the healthier kids resent it. And the data shows the person in a family who gets the most resources is the one who's the most vulnerable. And when the healthy people say you favor Johnny over me, it's not that they like Johnny better, but you're more worried about them and they are getting more resources. So at National Association of Mental Illness, they do run groups for siblings. And I know Al-Anon is also another wonderful resource for siblings and for parents and spouses if you have a family member who has a substance use disorder. I mean, I think the biggest thing that can help people is starting to talk with other people who have the same situation, because then you realize you're not alone. You stop blaming yourself in the same way, and you can begin to make a decision that hopefully will take into account your needs as well as your child's. I think social support is really the answer for so many things, where you get information, in caregiving groups, you get a lot of find out where is visiting nurse, who will fund this, who will fund that. But I think it helps you validate that your experience is not bizarre, that it's based on things that people normally will experience, guilt, rage, shame in this caregiving role. And, finding a way that you can make sense, that you can live with the stress that's there for everyone who's trying to do this. I mean, it's a difficult situation. And each of us has to find a way, to find some joy and some hope in all of this. And I think, in my groups, there's a lot of laughter and, people begin to, feel love and caring for each other. And then you begin to feel more again for yourself.
I love that you mentioned the community aspect of it, social support aspect of it. I was just having this conversation with someone else about how it's so common to say it takes a village when we're talking about raising children or taking care of children. But we don't apply that same philosophy to adults, older adults in any capacity, right? And I think that applies here too. It really takes a village to help out the family that is living with this experience.
Right. And I think senior centers begin to do that, begin to provide a village, a place where you can go and play mahjong and not worry about, how much your feet hurt. And, we need places where people who are no longer working can be and feel capable.
Yeah. My grandma loves her adult day center. We can't get her to take a day off.
Yeah, it's great.
As we wrap up, Judy, what is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to whether it's your book, your practice, your research, or just general difficult parenting?
I think to realize that if you have a son or a daughter who has, serious mental health challenges, many of us have, go to therapy or feel conflicted, but to learn about serious mental illness and begin to, if you're wearing blinders and keep thinking, oh, Johnny, he'll move out tomorrow, he's going to be okay. The fact that he got arrested, for beating up his girlfriend, it's going to be okay. If I just support him and love him, really try to pay attention to how serious their problem is, whether is it a mental health problem? Is it a substance use problem? Now it's awful that the marijuana that kids are taking is so much more powerful than it was years ago. And it's being documented that it's associated with psychotic episodes. So pay attention. If your kid is not working, if all their relationships are falling apart, let yourself see that there's a real problem there and think about what you can do and what you can't do to fix it. And then look for help. And if it is a mental health issue, think about going to NAMI to get information about it. If it's a substance use problem, go to Al-Anon. You need to talk to other people who are in a similar situation. And you also need to begin to forgive yourself that you are not so powerful that you caused all your kids' problems. We're living in a very hard world where it's hard to be a person. It's hard to be a kid. Drugs are very easily available. And, it's hard to negotiate all this and get help for yourself and connect with other mothers who are also dealing with this. But first, let yourself see what's going on. And if you let yourself see that your child really has a serious mental illness, it doesn't mean that you're a bad mother. It means that they have an illness, and the more you can recognize it, the more you'll be able to help them and help yourself if they can eventually get some help.
That was wonderful and a very emotional message, I think, for a lot of parents who might be experiencing this. Thank you so much, Judy, for this wonderful conversation. Thanks for talking about your research that's often very stigmatized and misunderstood. And thanks for doing the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for a really good conversation.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aging Together podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Aging Together, LLC, a caregiver coaching service with educational programming and support services for family caregivers of older adults. This episode was produced by me, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, in partnership with Natural Eye Media. If you found this episode of the Aging Together podcast valuable, we'd love your support in spreading the word. Please subscribe to the show. Your likes, shares, and reviews fuel our mission. Don't forget to rate and leave a review wherever you're listening. Your feedback matters. Until next time, take care.